"Stephanie, you've been at this for a while now. Mrs. Novak won't be pleased with us," said Jim, smiling at his daughter, who was fussing in front of the mirror. At just 5 years old, she carried herself with an unusual level of seriousness, which brought a constant smile to not just her father's face, but also to her caregivers. Mrs. Novak, her kindergarten teacher, would say that in all her years of experience, she had never seen such a unique child. Sometimes, Jim would come home tired, desiring some peace and quiet, but Stephanie would immediately sit down next to him and ask a question that she'd been contemplating for a while. "Dad, why do we dream?" she asked one day as soon as Jim settled on the couch. He smiled, sat her on his lap, and replied, "That's an excellent question, my little smarty. We dream because our brain never stops, even when we're sleeping, and it creates small stories and pictures that we see in our dreams." But Stephanie wasn't satisfied. "But why do we have different dreams? I dreamt about a princess, and Johnny from kindergarten said he saw himself on a spaceship." "Each person is unique, and we all have different thoughts and desires. Also, our brains show us things we learn during the day. That's why we have different dreams." "But what do brains do when we're awake and not dreaming?" And so it continued, until Jim completely forgot that he'd wanted to lie down with his eyes closed in complete silence just a few minutes ago. Ashley, Jim's wife and Stephanie's mother, sometimes said, "You know, dear, our daughter frightens me at times. Her reasoning is way beyond of a 5-year-old, and her questions sometimes leave me at a loss." Jim would just chuckle. "Honey, but this is a good thing. Look at her. She's only 5 and she's already won an award for creativity, as if she's in school." It was true. Jim and Ashley were very proud of their little girl, and always paid attention to her wishes and opinions. In general, people around them, their friends, never ceased to admire Jim's family, holding them up as an example to all. It seemed as if nothing could break their strong bonds. However, as it usually happens, even in seemingly perfect lives, unexpected challenges and problems arise. Jim was lost in thought and almost drove past the kindergarten. He had plenty to think about. His beloved wife Ashley had been acting strangely over the past few weeks. She seemed scared, avoiding eye contact, as if she was hiding something from him. When asked if everything was okay, she would respond in a way that quickly changed the subject. It couldn't be that she wasn't telling him something, whether it was a small mishap or a big problem. They had always had a relationship based on trust. Jim and Ashley met back in university. They were both rushing to their first lecture and accidentally got stuck in one of the old, not very reliable elevators. Ashley was pressing the emergency buttons with hope, but nothing was happening. The young couple had to call their friends to notify the authorities. All they could do now was wait for help to arrive. It was unclear how long it would take, but they didn't get disheartened and started to joke around. Jim picked up an improvised microphone and with a presenter's voice began. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a very special episode of our TV show, where we're stuck in an elevator and have the most fascinating stories for you." Playing the role of a host, Jim asked Ashley, "How do you feel being here?" Ashley, who was on the verge of claustrophobia-induced panic attack, broke into laughter. It was clear that Jim's resourcefulness had somewhat relaxed her. Sensing she was still panicked, Jim himself answered the question in a feminine voice. "Oh, it's quite a romantic place for a date, but I'd prefer a rooftop restaurant." They laughed at the joke and continued to chat. Half an hour flew by like a couple of minutes. Finally, the elevator started moving. Jim and Ashley were free, and with a smile, they realized that this incident had led to a memorable encounter. From that day on, they became good friends and always reminisced about this amusing story. However, soon, Jim began to see more than just a friend in the beautiful girl. He admired her beauty, was in awe of her actions, and felt happy to be around her. It took him a while to confess his feelings, fearing that if she didn't reciprocate, he might lose their friendship. But it couldn't continue like this. One day, Jim decided to take the leap. He asked Ashley for a walk. She was surprised to see him holding a huge bouquet, but what impressed her even more were his words about being in love with her for quite a while. That day, Jim learned that she had been harboring the same feelings for him. They laughed and agreed from that day to keep no secrets from each other. They dated for a long time and got married right after graduating. They planned everything ahead and had Stephanie. Next on their plans was to open a small organic food store They were saving money, and by the next year, they were supposed to start making their dream a reality. He loved Ashley, adored his daughter, and would do anything for them. At the same time, he knew Ashley would do the same. That's why her recent behavior alarmed and saddened him. He occasionally thought that Ashley might have another man, but he instantly dismissed such thoughts. It was too painful for him to even contemplate the past. Jim didn't want history to repeat itself, didn't want to relive the horrors of his parents' relationship. His family, the one he was brought up in, the one everyone around him considered perfect, was anything but that in reality. He vividly remembered that day as if it was yesterday. He had come home early from school because he was suffering from a throbbing headache and the teacher had allowed him to leave. Upon entering his house, he immediately heard the loud voices of his parents. Nervously, he walked into the living room and arrived just in time to witness his father hit his mother. She was knocked back onto the couch from the force of the blow, letting out a soft groan of pain. His father, with an ominous look on his face, moved toward her. Jim, without thinking, threw himself in between them. "Leave Mom alone!" was all the young boy could shout, holding back the tears that were threatening to spill out. The idea of such violence was so foreign to him, he simply couldn't comprehend it. His father paused in front of him, fists clenched. "She is to blame for everything. You'll understand this soon enough." But Jim didn't flinch. He stood there, between his mother and father, meeting his father's gaze unblinkingly. His father just waved him off and walked away, leaving his mother in tears. She cried, clutching Jim close to her, muttering incomprehensible words. Occasionally through her sobs, Jim caught phrases like, "I'm sorry, and you'll understand someday." Indeed, he did understand what his mother meant, but only years later. What followed was a painful divorce. His father, Walter Douglas, had a lot of connections. In court, he managed to gain custody of Jim. Furthermore, his father's lawyers painted his mother Natalie in such a negative light that the court barred her from coming near her son. In court, his mother wept, gripping his hands tightly, but Jim just stood silently, not moving and not meeting her gaze. Walter told him that their mother had betrayed them, that she had another man, and that she had chosen him over them. The realization was painful, deeply hurtful, and bitter. As Jim grew older, he started to understand that things were not as simple as he had thought. His father was a cruel man. When he was small, he saw but did not attribute importance to many things. Frequently, his mother had bruises and cuts, which she would explain to him as accidents due to her clumsiness. Jim couldn't recall a time when his mother openly voiced her opinions or challenged his father. In recent times, she hardly ever smiled, except when she was alone with him. One day, while rummaging through old stuff in the storeroom, he came across a thin notebook. It revealed many events and circumstances of his mother's life. The moments she couldn't bear to keep inside were poured out in this written confession. From what he read, Jim deduced the following. Natalie, his mother, had endured her husband's harsh treatment with fortitude, always striving to be a good wife. From the beginning, she felt indebted to him. Early in their married life, Natalie had noticed Walter's despotic traits. He never tolerated objections, controlled everything in the house, forbade her from working, restricted her social interactions, and could lose his temper for any reason. The primary cause for his anger was jealousy. He was suspicious of every man around his wife. Natalie always believed that if he was jealous, it meant he loved her. Then Jim was born. His young mother transferred all her love and care to him. It all happened when she ended up in the hospital following yet another scandal stirred by her husband. Understandably, she didn't share the real reason behind it with anyone. Due to complications, she had to stay in the hospital for around 10 days. During this time, she was cared for by a young doctor who turned out to be sensitive, kind, and responsive. He showed interest and care for her, setting her apart from the rest of the patients. And so it happened. After a long period of neglect, lack of tender attention and care, she became fond of this man. Initially, it was just innocent interaction. The doctor periodically called her, citing the need to monitor his patient's conditions. He gave professional advice, asked her to take care of herself. Then, during one of the follow-up visits, the doctor invited Natalie for coffee. Gradually, everything evolved into a romantic relationship. The man urged her to leave her husband and come to him as soon as possible. He even offered to confront her husband together. However, Natalie insisted on handling the situation herself. She didn't want to deceive Walter, but was fearful of his reaction. She also worried that her young son wouldn't understand. Nonetheless, she finally decided to confess. However, she could never have imagined that her husband would find out about everything much earlier, and so the inevitable happened. Jim now clearly understood how difficult it was for his mother in their home. He missed her and often asked his father about her whereabouts, only to be met with shouts. He resolved that once he became independent, he would definitely find her. But just as he turned 16, his father gave him a letter. It revealed that his mother was no more. Her sister had asked for Jim to be brought to the funeral, because Natalie missed him and kept repeating his name on the deathbed. However, the letter had been sent 2 weeks earlier. At first, Jim thought it was due to a postal delay, but then realized his father had deliberately held the letter back, making it pointless to attend. Jim never forgave his father for this act. As soon as he turned 18, he left his mother's diary in front of his father and hastily left the family home. After that, he didn't see him, only occasionally calling to check if he was okay, but their conversations never extended beyond formal inquiries. Neither man found the right words for each other, and their strained interaction always ended there. "Dad, didn't you forget we're heading to the daycare?" Jim snapped back to reality and stepped on the brakes. "Sorry, Stephanie, I was lost in thought." Stephanie raised her index finger. "Dad, you can't zone out behind the wheel, especially when there are kids in the car." He smiled. "Yes, I know, sweetheart. I promise it won't happen again." Stephanie, satisfied with the response, got out of the car. "Mrs. Novak," Jim signaled to the caregiver, who, nudging Stephanie towards the door, approached him. Stephanie was complaining about Daniel picking on the girls, and it seems she's planning to set things right. Could you please keep an eye on her? Jim bid her goodbye and headed to work. He had a tough day ahead, and in the evening, Ashley was picking up Stephanie. After breakfast, Stephanie, seeing Daniel, decided to settle their scores. Daniel was ready for the confrontation, and it escalated into a serious fight. By the time Mrs. Novak, the caretaker, could intervene and separate the two, the little girl had received a scrape on her nose. The injury was minor, but it upset her. "Let's go to our nurse. She can have a look," suggested Mrs. Novak. Stephanie agreed. She didn't want to look unattractive. Misty, the nurse, gave her a kind smile. She was only 3 days into this job at the daycare, but she was absolutely loving it. The work, the staff, and the children. "What's your name?" Misty asked. "Stephanie," the girl replied, studying the young nurse carefully. "And I know you," she added. Misty smiled. "Is that so? And from where?" "Your picture is in my dad's wallet." At this, Mrs. Novak raised an eyebrow, and Misty blushed in surprise. She didn't even have a boyfriend at the moment. She couldn't imagine whose wallet her picture might be in. "Stephanie, that can't be right," Mrs. Novak objected. "It's true, it's been there for a long time," Stephanie insisted. Misty looked helplessly at Mrs. Novak, but the older woman pursed her lips and looked at her with a hint of hostility. Mrs. Novak had always been a strong believer in family values and fidelity, and she immediately suspected Misty of having an affair with Jim. That evening, when Ashley came to pick up Stephanie and heard about the fight from the daycare teacher, Stephanie said, "Mom, Mrs. Novak didn't tell you everything." "Oh, what did she leave out?" Ashley asked, smiling at her daughter. "We have a new nurse, and her picture is in Dad's wallet." Ashley dropped her bag. She must have heard wrong. "What? Are you sure? That can't be true," she stammered. "It is, Mom. Haven't you seen it? Look, there she is." Stephanie pointed out Misty, who was leaving the daycare building and heading for the bus stop. A young, tall, beautiful woman. Ashley's heart clenched painfully. Scary thoughts began to flood her mind. She had been anxious, unsure of how to discuss certain news with her husband. Now, it seemed, there was no need for that conversation. She had assumed that this news would be significant to Jim. She had been gathering courage to tell him that she was pregnant. Despite Jim enthusiastically describing their future life together, Ashley did not want to follow their planned path. She really wanted this baby, and it seemed that this baby would be wanted only by her. Stephanie noticed the change in her mother's mood, but wisely kept quiet as they silently made their way home. Jim came home late from work. Oddly, Ashley didn't greet him. This had never happened before. Even when he returned in the middle of the night, his lightly sleeping wife would always stir and rise to meet him. But this time, silence. It only confirmed to him that something was off in their family. This needed to be addressed. His head swarmed with a hive of wild thoughts, and his heart was heavy. Quietly, he got into bed, aware that Ashley wasn't asleep. She was pretending to sleep quite convincingly, but he chose not to acknowledge it. He would wait until morning. If Ashley didn't want to talk now, he would respect her silence. But come morning, they would get to the bottom of this, whatever it was. They always figured things out, together. Morning came, and he woke up to the sound of commotion from the kitchen and his daughter's disgruntled voice. Blast! He had almost overslept. Stephanie was already pumping in front of the mirror, inspecting her scratch, while Ashley was in the kitchen. He walked in and sat down next to his daughter. "Sweetheart, what happened to your face? Don't tell me you ended up fighting with Daniel after all," he asked, letting out a sigh. "But now he will think twice before picking on anyone. Dad, how long will this scratch stay on my nose?" Stephanie looked up at him, clearly upset. Jim gave her a warm smile and gently kissed her on the nose. "Well, now it will heal much faster." He glanced at his wife. "Right, dear?" Ashley instantly turned to him and said sternly, "Jim, we need to talk." "I was about to suggest that. Let's talk," replied the man, still smiling, but doubt was already creeping into his heart. Ashley gave him a long look, then abruptly got up, ran out into the hallway, and returned with a clear file. "Here, I've been trying to figure out how to tell you this, where to start. I was scared of how you'd react. Anyway, I'm pregnant." Jim beamed for a moment, but quickly realized from his wife's expression that there was more. "I'm not planning on terminating the pregnancy. Yes, we didn't plan for this, but that's not important now. I know about you and your nurse." Taken aback by this unexpected twist, the husband blinked in confusion. "I don't understand. Repeat that? What nurse?" "What nurse?" Ashley rolled her eyes. "Oh, Jim, stop the charade. I've always trusted you. I thought you'd never betray me, but now I feel like a complete fool. How could you? As if it's not enough that you're cheating on me with a nurse from the kindergarten. Stephanie also said that you have her photos in your wallet. I've seen this girl, young, beautiful, at least 10 years younger than you. Of course, I guess I'm just not that attractive anymore." Jim closed his eyes and massaged his temples. His head ached from the overload of information. The joy of finding out he was going to have a baby was overshadowed by the context in which the news was delivered. What on earth does the nurse, who I've never even seen, have to do with anything? "Honey, are you out of your mind? Have I ever given you a reason to doubt me? And I don't have any photos in my wallet." He bolted from the room. He brought back his wallet. He opened it. It contained credit cards, documents, money, a family photo of theirs, and behind it, a very old picture. "Here, the only photos I have are ours and Mom's, that's all." Then Ashley and Jim exchanged a look, and then in unison said, "Stephanie, could you come here?" Their daughter came into the kitchen and gave her parents a strange look. She was scared. She'd never heard her mom and dad shout at each other like that. "Stephanie, what photo were you talking about?" The little girl pointed to the picture in her dad's hands. "This one. It's our nurse." Jim and Ashley got dressed in 3 minutes, and within 5 were speeding in their car towards their daughter's nursery school. Truthfully, Jim couldn't understand how this could possibly be. His mother was dead, and that girl was very young. Ashley went to drop their daughter off at her group, to then join Jim. He went straight to the medical section. Misty looked up in surprise as a grown man stormed in. "Hello? Can I help you?" "Apparently, I need your help," he said, catching his breath after the run. "I'm Stephanie's father." Misty suddenly remembered yesterday's incident. She felt extremely uncomfortable under the long, hard stare of the man. She was already standing up to escort the man out, but froze when she heard him ask, "Excuse me, was your mother's name Natalie?" "Yes." "What does all this mean? And how do you know my mother?" The girl was utterly confused when the man suddenly broke into tears. His hands trembling, he pulled an old photo out of his pocket and placed it in front of her. He wiped his wet face with the back of his hand and softly said, "She's my mother too." It seemed the man wanted to say more, but he just sank into a chair. not taking his eyes off her. Misty sat down too, the paws stretched on. The two of them sat in silence, looking at each other. Finally, Misty was the first to speak. "But how? How could this be? I thought I would never meet my brother. I had given up all attempts to find you." Upon hearing her last words, the man perked up. "You were looking for me? So Mom told you about me? How much did you know?" "Very little. Just your name, and later your address. But when I got there, I found a family who knew nothing about the previous owners." Just as he was about to ask more questions, there was a knock on the door, and his wife Ashley and Mrs. Novak walked in. Mrs. Novak clicked her tongue disapprovingly and gave Misty a chilling look. However, Jim didn't notice this as he quietly said to Misty, "This is my wife Ashley. Ashley, this is my younger sister." The women stood in stunned silence. The corners of Ashley's lips raised ever so slightly, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Now that all the misunderstandings had been sorted out, they had the opportunity to talk. Jim had a million questions which he unloaded on his newfound sister. She smiled and began to tell her story from the beginning. Misty had been a bright and curious child. Her childhood was spent in a picturesque small town, surrounded by loving and caring parents. Her father worked as a doctor at the local hospital. Her mother managed their home and cultivated beautiful flowers in their garden. Misty loved watching her mother hum a gentle melody while tending to her garden, her face radiating absolute happiness. In the evenings when the family gathered for dinner, her father would always scoop Misty up in his arms and spin her around, her giggles filling the air. Then they would sit at the table, engaging in lively conversations over a delicious meal. However, sharp-eyed Misty occasionally noticed her mother drifting away in thought, recalling something sad and shedding tears when she thought no one was watching. When Misty asked about how her mother met her father, eager to hear the love story of her parents, her mother would only share bits and pieces, often stopping mid-sentence. She always skipped over the parts of her life before she met Misty's father. One day, while searching for a doll in the attic that her mother had put away the previous summer, Misty accidentally stumbled upon an old dusty box hidden behind a stack of books on a shelf. Inside the box were photographs, one of which featured a boy, strikingly similar to herself, in her mother's arms. Surprised by her discovery, she rushed to show her mother. "Mom, look what I found!" Misty placed the worn-out photographs in her mother's hand. Her mother took a glance at them and gasped, abruptly sitting down on a nearby chair. "Where did you find these, Misty?" "Up there in the attic. But who is this boy, Mom? He looks so much like me." Struggling to find her voice, her mother examined the photograph for a long time. Finally, she looked up and whispered, "The boy in the photograph is your older brother." After learning about her mother's history, the little girl hugged her and asked why she hadn't spoken about it earlier. Her mother gently stroked her hair. "I was always scared that if I told you about him, it would make your life harder. I wanted you to grow up in joy and love, not knowing sorrow and pain. But I couldn't imagine how wise my little girl has become, how grown up you are now." That was the first and last time Misty heard about the existence of her brother from her mother. Soon after, her parents were involved in a car accident. The driver of the oncoming vehicle had lost control. Her father managed to survive the crash, but her mother, despite fighting for several hours in the hospital, couldn't make it. Even after all these years, it was painful for Jim to hear about his mother's death. He asked Misty, "What happened next? How did you live?" "Next? After that it was just my father and me. We managed to get through the dark times, supporting each other. He did everything and more to ensure my happiness. Therefore I didn't ask him about you, fearing it would cause him pain. However, when I turned 18, he told me himself. He thought I had a right to know. Your father is a good man." "Yes, he is wonderful." Jim and Ashley sat in silence for a long while. Then Jim said regretfully, "Just think about it. We've wasted so much time." But Ashley, sitting next to her husband, placed her hand on his and gently squeezed. She looked at Misty with warmth. "Let's not regret the time we've lost. It's up to us to decide how we use the time we have now. Let's act in a way that we won't regret anything in the future." That evening, the couple invited Misty and her father to dinner before they carried on with their own tasks. Later the same evening, they gathered again at a restaurant. Misty's father, Alan Piper, turned out to be a very pleasant, cultured man. Jim watched with admiration as he displayed tender care for his daughter, his eyes warm as he watched her and looked after her needs. However, the more Jim observed his sister, the more a certain thought crept into his mind. Misty, of course, was very similar to their mother, but her green eyes speckled with gold differed entirely from their mother's gray ones and father's brown ones. They were the exact same as Jim's, and as someone else's. "Mr. Piper, may I ask you a question?" He approached Alan when the women, along with Stephanie, went to freshen up. Misty's father looked at him and smiled. "You have been watching me all evening. I would be the last fool if I didn't realize what you wanted to ask. And yes, the answer to your question is yes, it's true." Jim was taken aback. "Have you always known?" "From the very first day. After all, Natalie told me immediately, and I would have figured it out over time. But Misty doesn't know about it." He removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and continued, "If you're planning to tell her, please choose another time, not today. Of course, don't worry about it. Thank you." In Jim's eyes, Alan became even more worthy of respect. After all, he treated Misty as his own daughter, even knowing she wasn't biologically so. He provided her with a good upbringing and always gave her unconditional love. Jim looked at Alan, and his heart warmed with the knowledge that this man had provided his mother with at least some happiness in her life. Jim was profoundly grateful to him. The next day, for the first time in many years, Jim wanted to speak with his father. Walter grumbled as he rose from his chair and made his way to the front door. He was surprised that someone was knocking on his small apartment's door. The only visitors he usually had were food delivery couriers, and he was not expecting any orders, so he approached the door with a certain amount of caution. "Who's there?" "Please open the door." "It's me." A stunned Walter thought he heard the voice of his son. Perhaps his deep sense of guilt and desire to reconcile with his son, coupled with his inability to make the first move, were leading to such hallucinations, he thought. He took a deep breath and opened the door. In front of him stood a tall young man looking him in the eye. It really was Jim. Unable to say anything, the older man simply stepped aside, allowing his son into the apartment. Jim immediately started to ramble, not looking at his father. "Dad, I was scared that if I didn't come today, I would regret it later. I have something to tell you, and we need to sort out our relationship once and for all." "I'm sorry." "What?" Jim looked at his father and saw so much remorse and pain in his eyes that he was taken aback. He had assumed his father would argue with him in his usual stubborn, uncompromising manner or ignore him. But standing before him was an aged, hunched man with once bright green eyes that had lost their sparkle. At a single glance, it was evident that this man had been drowning in despair for years. "Please forgive me for everything, son. I owe you and your mother so much. I regret everything. How I wish I could make things right, but I fear that even if I were to live my life over, I would act just as I did before. It was only the long days of solitude that made me realize how wrong I was. I thought about calling you so many times, but I was afraid you wouldn't want to hear me. God, I'm such a coward." Jim stared at his father, who could now not stop the torrent of words he had been holding back all these years. This conversation was a long-awaited moment for Walter. Jim heard sincere words from his always stern, arrogant father for the first time. He hadn't imagined how much it would stun him. "Dad, I had no idea," he sighed. The father looked at his son with deep concern in his eyes. He knew that he had spoiled many things in their lives. "Son, you hate me, and I understand you." "I don't hate you, Dad, and we definitely will talk about this. But right now, I want to say something else. If it weren't for one circumstance, to be honest, I don't know if I would have come to see you or not." Jim faltered a little, then blurted out, "Dad, you have a daughter." Walter abruptly stopped and for the first time seemed to ponder. His heart skipped a beat and he asked to sit down. Jim told Walter everything. His first desire was to meet Alan. By the next day, he was already sitting across from him. Walter nervously fiddled with the button on his shirt sleeve. Sitting opposite Alan, he broke the lengthy silence and began to speak. "I've hated you all my life. I considered you the vile man who stole my wife." He then looked around and saw photographs of Misty. Slowly, tears began to form in his eyes. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't hold them back. Alan sat quietly, offering a weak smile. "It's okay, Walter." Alan slowly rose and walked over to Walter. He took his hand and gave him a strong embrace. Walter sobbed even more and said, "Forgive me. Thank you for everything. Thank you for raising my daughter and for becoming her real father." "Natalie never spoke ill of you, and she never held a grudge. She only remembers that you once saved her," responded Alan, his words only serving to break Walter's heart further. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," was all that Walter could repeat. Meeting Alan was a true revelation for Walter. He saw in him a man who, despite all the hardships of life, remained committed and caring. Walter realized that this was the kind of father and husband Natalie and Misty deserved. Someone capable of giving them love and support. Someone he himself could never have been for them. Walter decided not to disturb his daughter and shatter the beautiful world in which her father was Alan. It was a difficult decision to make. He did not consider himself worthy to be called her father. 6 months had passed. "Misty, why is it taking so long?" Misty was holding Stephanie on her lap, flipping through the pages of a picture book. "Jim, calm down. This isn't your first time becoming a father." "Not the first time, but this time it's different." Misty smiled. She knew the reason, but Ashley had strictly forbidden her from telling Jim. The door swung open and a nurse stepped out. "Are you still here?" Jim looked at her with wary eyes. "Don't worry, everything went well. Of course the boys are a bit weak, but that's normal when it's twins. Everything will be fine by tomorrow." He blinked. Once, twice. Misty stifled a laugh into her fist. Jim gave her a stern look. "You knew? What a sister you are!" He then sank into his chair. "So what you're saying is, I have 2 sons?" The nurse nodded. "Exactly. Looks like your wife had a surprise for you." Jim offered a silly smile. "Life is indeed full of surprises." He sprung up, wrapping everyone in a group hug. 2 sons! Wow! After returning home, the entire family hosted a grand dinner. When everyone sat down, Alan looked at his watch and stood up. He asked for everyone's attention and began to speak. "I'm glad we're all here. I'm very happy for you. Jim and Ashley, I apologize for the decision I made. I invited your father, Jim." He looked at Jim and everyone fell silent. Alan hesitated. It had been difficult to keep the little truth from his daughter. He was very concerned about how Misty would react. "I know he once caused Natalie a lot of pain, but he has changed and repented. We need to be forgiving and give him a second chance." Walter entered the room. Misty smiled and looked at him, but her smile vanished instantly. She stared at him intently, and slowly the realization dawned on her. Misty took a deep breath, her eyes still locked on Walter. She was silent for a moment, letting the revelation sink in. The room was heavy with tension. Everyone watched as Walter moved closer to the table. His eyes were watery, full of years of regret and longing. "Hello, Misty," he said quietly. Nobody said anything. The room was silent, and everyone was waiting for Misty's reaction. "I'm so sorry," Walter said, his voice barely audible. Misty felt a lump in her throat. Misty began, but words failed her. Walter seemed to understand. He offered her a sad, small smile, nodding as though he had expected this reaction. "Take your time, Misty," he said. "I've waited this long. I can wait a bit more." After that night, the family's dynamics slowly changed. It took time, but Misty eventually grew comfortable with Walter's presence. There were awkward moments, misunderstandings, but they worked through them, strengthening their bond day by day. Jim and Ashley's 2 healthy boys brought joy and chaos into their lives. Stephanie adored her new brothers, and the family thrived. Walter became a regular part of their lives, always a bit distant, but making an effort to be there. He had lost many years, but was determined to make the most of the time he had left. As for Alan, he watched with contentment. He had raised Misty as his own, and loved her unconditionally. Now he had the satisfaction of seeing his family complete and at peace, knowing he had made the right decisions.
Women just don't have the head for this kind of thing, Richard said, leaning back in his chair and clasping his hands behind his head like he'd just delivered some profound wisdom. It's not personal, Sandra. Finance is a high-pressure game. Kevin's the natural choice for something like this. I sat across the table, my jaw tightening as I stared at the spreadsheet I'd spent hours preparing. My hands itched to crumple the pages in front of me, but I forced myself to keep my composure. Richard, I began evenly, I've been managing multi-million-dollar portfolios for the last 6 years. My firm's performance has consistently ranked in the top 5 across the region. He waved a dismissive hand. I'm sure you're great at what you do over there, but this is family. We need someone who can focus on our specific goals, and Kevin understands what's at stake. Kevin, seated smugly beside him, grinned like he'd already won the lottery. He was 24, fresh out of business school, and hadn't so much as balanced a personal budget before now. But he was Richard's biological son, which apparently made him a financial prodigy in their eyes. I glanced at Kevin, his confidence irritating me more than his inexperience. Kevin, what's your plan for managing the portfolio? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He blinked, caught off guard. Well, he stammered. I thought I'd start with some high-growth tech stocks. You know, ride the wave. Richard nodded approvingly. Exactly. Bold moves. That's what this portfolio needs. I felt my stomach churn. Bold moves? That was their strategy? I'd spent a decade in finance, carefully analyzing risk and reward, building diversified portfolios, and studying market trends. And now I was being told that my expertise wasn't enough because I was a woman. My name is Sandra, and for as long as I can remember, I've had to fight to be taken seriously. As a financial analyst, I've worked my way up in an industry where being underestimated is almost routine. But this was different. This wasn't a random colleague making a condescending comment in a meeting. This was my stepfather, dismissing me in favor of my stepbrother, a man with no experience, no credentials, and no clue what he was doing. I joined Richard's family when I was 12, after my mom remarried. He'd always been stern, but fair in his own way, treating my stepbrother and me equally, until now. His favoritism for Kevin had grown more blatant over the years, and it was never clearer than at this moment. The family portfolio wasn't just a casual investment. It was the culmination of years of work, meant to secure a comfortable future for all of us. I had pored over the numbers, outlining a comprehensive plan to maximize returns while mitigating risk. But none of that mattered. Richard's biases ran deeper than I'd realized. As I drove home that evening, my mind raced with frustration. It's not personal. That's what Richard had said, but it couldn't have felt more personal. I'd worked tirelessly to prove myself in a field dominated by men, only to have my own family dismiss my capabilities entirely. When I walked through the door, my husband Mike was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. He looked up and smiled. How'd it go? He asked. I sighed, dropping my bag onto the counter. It was a disaster, I said, recounting the conversation. Richard handed the portfolio to Kevin. Apparently, women aren't cut out for finance. Mike frowned, setting down the knife. He actually said that? Verbatim, I replied, pouring myself a glass of water. And Kevin just sat there, grinning like he'd already made his first million. Mike shook his head. That's ridiculous. You've been doing this for years. Kevin probably doesn't even know how to read a balance sheet. Exactly, I said, my voice rising. But it doesn't matter. Richard sees me as a risk and Kevin as a reward, even though the numbers say the opposite. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I wasn't going to waste any more energy trying to change Richard's mind. Instead, I would let my work speak for itself. My firm's portfolio had been growing steadily, and I was already in talks to lead a high-stakes project that could put my team on the map. If Richard wanted to believe that Kevin was a financial genius, fine. But in a year, when the dust settled, I knew exactly whose results would stand out, and whose would crumble under the weight of overconfidence. For now, I would step back and let them play their game, but I couldn't help but feel a surge of determination as I imagined the moment when the truth would finally come to light. For the first few weeks after the meeting, I tried not to think about the portfolio. It wasn't easy. Every time Kevin posted a vague, crushing it in finance update on social media, or Richard made an offhand comment about Kevin's big plans, I felt my blood boil. But I kept my head down and focused on my own work. At my firm, things were moving fast. I'd recently been assigned to manage a high-profile client's portfolio, and I poured all my energy into crafting a strategy that was both innovative and airtight. Late nights at the office became routine, and the hours of analyzing trends and running projections were exhausting, but rewarding. My colleague and mentor, Laura, noticed my extra effort one evening as we worked late. "You're really going all in on this one, aren't you?" she said, leaning against my desk. I nodded, smiling faintly. "It feels personal," I admitted. Laura raised an eyebrow. "The client?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "My stepfather. He passed me over for managing the family's portfolio. Gave it to my stepbrother instead. Said women aren't cut out for finance." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "He actually said that?" "Yep," I replied, the word heavy with bitterness. "So now, I'm making it my mission to prove him wrong." Meanwhile, back at home, the cracks in Kevin's supposed success were starting to show. At family dinners, Richard's once proud updates about Kevin's investments grew more vague. "It's a long-term strategy," he said one evening when I asked about the portfolio's performance. "Long-term?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That's code for it's not working right now. What's he investing in exactly?" Richard bristled, clearly annoyed by my question. "It's none of your concern, Sandra. Kevin has it under control." I let it go, but inside I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. I'd seen this happen too many times before. Overconfident investors chasing high-risk stocks without understanding the market. It was only a matter of time before the cracks turned into a full-blown collapse. At work, things were going in the opposite direction. The portfolio I managed began outperforming expectations, and clients were thrilled with the returns. Word spread quickly, and I was soon invited to present my strategy at a regional finance conference. It was a big deal, the kind of recognition that could propel my career to the next level. Laura was ecstatic when I told her. "This is your moment," she said. "Make it count." The night before the conference, as I rehearsed my presentation in the mirror, I thought about Richard and Kevin. A part of me wanted to send them an invite, just to see the look on their faces when I walked on stage. But I resisted the urge. This wasn't about them. This was about proving to myself, and the industry, that I belonged here. As the months went on, the gulf between Kevin's performance and mine became impossible to ignore. While my firm's portfolio continued to grow, Richard started dropping hints that things weren't going so well on Kevin's end. At first, it was small comments about market volatility and unforeseen challenges. But eventually, the truth slipped out. At another family dinner, Richard sighed heavily as we passed around dessert. "It's been a rough quarter," he admitted. "Kevin's portfolio has taken some hits." I glanced up from my plate, keeping my expression neutral. "Hits? What kind of hits?" Richard hesitated, clearly reluctant to elaborate. "Nothing catastrophic," he said quickly. "Just some setbacks." Kevin, who had been unusually quiet all evening, suddenly chimed in. "It's a tough market right now," he said defensively. "No one's seeing big returns." "That's not true," I said before I could stop myself. "Plenty of portfolios are thriving right now, if they're managed well." The room fell silent, and I could feel Richard's glare burning into me. "Not everyone has the luxury of working with institutional clients, Sandra," he said sharply. "Family portfolios are different." I nodded, biting back the retort that was on the tip of my tongue. Let them believe what they wanted. I didn't need to defend myself. My results spoke for themselves. By the time the one-year mark rolled around, the disparity was undeniable. Kevin's portfolio was struggling, weighed down by poor decisions and overconfidence. Meanwhile, My firm's results were being featured in industry publications, and I had just been named one of the top financial analysts in the region. The recognition came with an invitation to an awards gala, where I would be presented with a plaque for innovative portfolio management. As I stood on stage that evening, accepting the award, I thought about Richard and Kevin. They weren't in the audience, of course, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they heard about this. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, I got a call from Richard. "Sandra," he said, his tone unusually measured. "I saw your name in the Financial Times. Congratulations." "Thank you," I replied, keeping my voice calm. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I had no idea your firm was doing so well," he said finally. "I suppose I underestimated you." "You did," I said simply. "But I appreciate you saying that." The breakthrough came in the most unexpected way. Richard had always prided himself on staying informed about financial markets, reading industry magazines and watching the news religiously. But one evening, as I was wrapping up a presentation at work, I got a call from my husband, Mike. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his tone laced with humor. "Richard's glued to the TV. Your firm's results are being featured on Market Watch Live. They just mentioned your name." I froze, the weight of his words sinking in. "What did they say?" "They called you one of the top-performing portfolio managers in the region," Mike replied. "Richard's been silent for 20 minutes. A mix of pride and anticipation welled up inside me. For months, I'd been working tirelessly, achieving milestones that Richard had dismissed as impossible. And now, the proof was on national television. The next day, Richard called me, his voice noticeably subdued. "Sandra," he began, "I saw the segment on Market Watch last night. I had no idea your firm was doing so well." I let his words hang in the air for a moment before replying. "Thank you," I said evenly. "We've been working hard." He hesitated, then sighed. "I have to admit, I may have misjudged you. Your results are impressive." I leaned back in my chair, feeling a mix of satisfaction and vindication. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied, "but it's not about the recognition. It's about making smart, informed decisions, and that's something I've been doing for years." Richard didn't respond right away. Finally, he said, "Do you have time to come by this weekend? I'd like to talk." When I arrived at Richard's house on Saturday, the atmosphere was different. He greeted me at the door with none of his usual bravado, and Kevin was noticeably absent. As we sat in the living room, Richard cleared his throat and handed me a folder. "These are the latest figures from the family portfolio," he said, his voice low. "I thought you might want to take a look." I opened the folder and scanned the numbers. The losses were worse than I'd expected. Several high-risk investments had tanked, wiping out a significant portion of the portfolio's value. It was a stark contrast to the growth I'd achieved with my firm's clients. "Kevin told me it was just market volatility," Richard said, breaking the silence. "But after seeing your results, I'm starting to think it might be something else." "It's not just the market," I said, choosing my words carefully. "It's the decisions being made. Managing a portfolio requires more than just bold moves. It requires strategy, discipline, and a deep understanding of risk." Richard nodded slowly, his expression pained. "I thought I was doing the right thing, giving Kevin control. I wanted to give him a chance to prove himself. But I see now that I underestimated you, and overestimated him." Hearing those words from Richard felt surreal. For so long he'd dismissed me, refused to see my potential, and brushed aside my expertise. And now, sitting across from him, I saw something I'd never seen before. Regret. "I owe you an apology, Sandra," he said quietly. "I let my biases cloud my judgment. You've worked so hard, and I didn't give you the credit you deserved. That was wrong." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The vindication I'd craved was finally here, but it felt bittersweet. "Thank you," I said at last. "I appreciate that. But this isn't just about me. It's about what's best for the family. And if you want the portfolio to recover, we need to make some serious changes. Richard nodded, his expression resolute. I'd like you to take over, he said. If you're willing. I spent the next hour walking Richard through my recommendations, outlining a strategy to stabilize the portfolio and rebuild its value. It wasn't going to be easy, but I was confident we could turn things around. As I spoke, I saw something shift in Richard's demeanor, a newfound respect that had been missing for far too long. When we finished, Richard leaned back in his chair and let out a deep sigh. Sandra, he said, I don't know how to thank you. You didn't have to do this, not after the way I treated you, but you did. That says a lot about your character. I smiled, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't expected. This isn't about proving a point, I said. It's about doing what's right, for everyone. The days following our meeting felt strangely calm. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of frustration when I thought about my stepfather. Richard had finally acknowledged my abilities, not just as a financial professional, but as someone worthy of his respect. It wasn't an instant fix for the years of dismissal, but it was a start. At the next family dinner, the tension that usually accompanied conversations about finances was notably absent. Richard even mentioned the new strategy I had proposed. Sandra's got the portfolio on the right track, he said, glancing at me across the table. I should have listened to her sooner. Kevin shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. He hadn't said much since Richard had taken back control of the portfolio, and I couldn't help but notice the flicker of resentment in his expression. Part of me wanted to gloat, but I pushed the thought aside. This wasn't about Kevin. It was about ensuring the family's financial future was secure. Later that evening, as I helped clear the table, Richard pulled me aside. I know I've said it before, he began, his voice low, but I really am sorry for how I treated you. I let my biases get in the way, and I was wrong. I looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. Thank you, Richard, I said. That means a lot. And I want you to know I'm not holding any grudges. I just want to make sure we're all moving in the right direction. He nodded, his expression softening. You've got my full support. From now on, I'm trusting you to handle things. Hearing those words felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For so long, I'd been fighting to be seen, to prove that my abilities weren't tied to my gender or my place in the family. Now, I finally felt validated, not because I'd won, but because Richard had grown enough to see the truth. Over the following months, life settled into a new normal. With Richard's support, I fully took over managing the family portfolio. It wasn't just about undoing Kevin's mistakes. It was about building a system that could weather challenges in the years to come. I poured my knowledge into creating a diverse, balanced strategy, and the results spoke for themselves. Within 6 months, the portfolio began to recover, slowly but steadily. Richard kept his word and stayed out of my way, only stepping in to ask thoughtful questions or offer genuine praise when he saw the returns improving. It was a stark contrast to the man who had once dismissed me outright. The change wasn't just about respect. It was about trust. For the first time, I felt like he truly saw me, not as the stepdaughter, but as a capable professional. One evening, as we sat in his living room reviewing the latest performance reports, Richard leaned back and sighed. You know, Sandra, he began, I used to think I had all the answers. But this past year has taught me something important. Sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones who surprise you the most. I smiled, setting down the report. It's never too late to learn, I said gently. He nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. You've done more for this family than I can put into words. Thank you. Hearing those words felt like the closure I didn't know I needed. For so long, I'd been driven by the need to prove myself, but now, that drive felt different. It wasn't about validation anymore. It was about knowing my worth and standing firm in it. Outside of the family, my career continued to thrive. My success with the family portfolio caught the attention of other clients, leading to new opportunities and challenges at work. The recognition I'd received at the awards gala was only the beginning, and I finally felt like I was stepping into the career I'd always envisioned. At home, the dynamic with Richard had shifted in ways I hadn't expected. He'd grown more supportive, not just of my professional efforts, but of me as a person. The tension that once defined our relationship was replaced with mutual respect, and while it didn't erase the past, it gave me hope for the future. The journey wasn't easy, but it taught me something invaluable. You can't force people to see your worth. Sometimes you just have to keep doing the work, letting your results speak louder than their doubts. And when the recognition finally comes, it's not about their apology. It's about knowing you've always been capable, even when they couldn't see it. As I left Richard's house that evening, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. I had finally claimed my place, not just in the family, but in my own life.
Today, Janice found herself in an unusually buoyant mood. The reason being, she was just days away from her long-anticipated break. It was her final week at work, and the prospect of an upcoming vacation fueled her excitement. After efficiently completing her work duties, she made her way home, completely unaware of the surprise that awaited her. That evening, she arrived home, her spirits higher than usual. Spotting her husband's packed suitcase in the hallway brought a delighted smile to her face. She assumed he had taken the initiative to pack for their vacation. Sean, her husband, was never particularly good at packing, yet this time he had not only managed to do it himself, but also found the travel pillow something she found both amusing and endearing. "Sean, my love, I'm back," Janice cheerfully announced as she entered the kitchen, but her happiness abruptly faded upon seeing the sight before her. Sean was seated at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in hand. He was dressed not in his usual casual home attire, but as if he was ready to leave the house. "Sweetheart, what's happening? Are you heading out?" she asked, her confusion apparent. "Janice, I'm weary," Sean began, his tone somber. "I need to go now. I need some time to unwind, to rest. I'm afraid I might be depressed." Janice stared at her husband, bewilderment clouding her eyes. "Darling, what do you mean? Can't you wait just one more week?" Janice was at a loss, unable to comprehend the sudden shift in her husband's mood. "You wouldn't understand, Janice," he replied tersely. "You're always cheerful at work, surrounded by your supportive team. Meanwhile, I'm here feeling low and in desperate need of a break." Her eyes then fell on a bank statement lying on the table. To her dismay, it was clear that Sean had transferred the money they had painstakingly saved together into his personal account. Holding the statement, she said, "Sean, what depression are you referring to? We've been saving this money for our shared vacation, for our trip to the Bahamas." "I've been eagerly waiting for this day, and now you're asking me to delay it because your work won't permit you a vacation?" Sean retorted, his voice beginning to show irritation. Janice could feel her anger brewing. "I never said my work wouldn't grant me a vacation," she fired back. "In fact, I agreed with them today that this is my last week. Besides, we never set a specific date for our trip. Why would you plan your leave now, when I can't join?" "You're not being rational today, Janice," he rebuked her. "I told you I'm exhausted. I've had enough of the dreary cold weather. I need a change, somewhere warm, somewhere peaceful." "And what about me?" she demanded, feeling neglected. Her husband merely shrugged in response. "Well, practically speaking, you can't come along. You're tied up with work. I don't understand why we're arguing about this. I'm the head of the family, and I get to decide what's best for us." Sean's brows furrowed, his anger visible. She watched him pack the rest of his belongings. This wasn't some ill-conceived jest. He was serious about leaving alone, without her. "But Sean, that's not fair," she protested. "We saved that money together. If you can't wait for me, at least you should only take your share. Once I get my leave, I'll join you or go somewhere else, using my portion." Sean paused and looked at her, his face devoid of empathy. "What do you want, Janice? Do you want me to stay and have a mental breakdown? How am I supposed to divide the money? What if I run out? How about this? If there's anything left, I'll bring it back. And Janice, I have a huge favor to ask. Don't ruin my mood before the trip. I've mentally already embarked on this journey. In fact, I've booked my flight for tonight." Janice was rendered speechless by his audacity, by the fact that he had already booked his ticket for that very evening. Words seemed to elude her. Pang of hurt constricted her throat, and she retreated to her room to avoid witnessing her husband's departure. She had sensed something amiss lately. He'd been acting out of character, coming home late, initiating uncharacteristic, lengthy conversations. She just couldn't put her finger on why his behavior had suddenly altered. Janice had initially tucked away such troubling thoughts. The fear of confronting them was too daunting. She didn't want to dwell on suspicions that might turn out to be baseless. Instead, she decided to calmly assess the situation. Could it be that she was overreacting? Maybe it wasn't so unusual for a married couple to take separate vacations occasionally. But then, the resounding slam of the front door caused Janice to startle. Did he just leave without even saying goodbye? That can't be happening, she pondered. She stepped out of the room, only to be greeted by the harsh reality that it indeed could happen. Just as she was on the brink of tears, something on the table caught her eye. Sean had left his phone behind. He had a password she didn't know, but an incoming message briefly lit up the screen, providing her enough time to read it. I'm already at the airport, waiting for you, babe. Give me a call when you get there. Before she could process the message, the front door creaked open and Sean re-entered. He eyed Janice suspiciously, grabbed his phone, then planted a quick kiss on her cheek. I've got a dash, love. Don't worry about a thing. Janice was momentarily frozen, then swiftly dressed and bolted out the door, frantically waving for a taxi. Their ride to the airport was the longest, most excruciating journey she'd ever taken. She didn't know where to look for him, but unfortunately, they were immediately noticeable, their behavior reminiscent of smitten high school sweethearts. The woman was considerably younger than her. A gasp escaped Janice as she covered her mouth with her hand, watching them from a distance. So, this was it. 5 years of married life. 5 years of believing we were a happy family, she mused. Janice and Sean's story had begun in college. Sean was late for an English class. He was the last one to enter, and there was only one vacant seat. By a stroke of fate, that seat was right next to a very beautiful girl, Janice. Janice was a radiant beauty, so stunning that many guys felt too intimidated to approach her. This lack of attention, paradoxically, dented Janice's self-confidence. She started to believe something was amiss with her, so when Sean ended up sitting next to her, she was immediately intrigued by his apparent courage. For Sean, however, he saw no other choice. He felt at ease sitting next to such an attractive girl, not because he was overly confident, but rather because he deemed himself invisible to her. He believed that he didn't stand a chance, so there was nothing to lose or be nervous about. When a class discussion paired them up, Sean found a reason to talk to her. That's when he discovered that Janice was not just beautiful, but also humble and friendly. Maybe that was when he realized he could sway Janice to his favor. As time went on, Sean grew more comfortable chatting with her, even forgetting their perceived social gap. One day, he offered her a ride home after class. By the end of the semester, they were officially dating. After graduation, they took the next step and got married. But now, their marital bliss had crumbled. Sean was using their shared savings to whisk his mistress away to the Bahamas, while Janice would have to return to work the next day. She would come home to an empty house, waiting for her husband's return from his escapade. She felt utterly alone, without anyone to confide in, seek advice from, or even just vent to. Janice had grown up fatherless, a void that had always gnawed at her. She never experienced a father's guidance, love, or protection, a hollow feeling that left her feeling incomplete. People told her that as she grew older, she would overcome the absence and move on, but the opposite happened. The void magnified over time. In retrospect, she realized she tolerated so much of Sean's unacceptable behavior because she had no model of how a man should treat her. It pained her every time she mulled over this, and now it hurt even more as she found herself stranded in her sorrow with no one to turn to. Janice lost her mother at the tender age of 18. She had since been living with her aunt, but she always felt like an outsider. Her aunt insisted that Janice receive the same treatment as her own children, but Janice knew otherwise. She understood there was no substitute for a mother's love. She managed to stick it out with her aunt's family until she could escape to college. In the blossoming phase of their relationship, living with Sean was nothing short of a paradise for her. The world seemed brighter, and their home was a cocoon of joy and love. However, as the leaves of time turned over, she began to unravel a less pleasing facet of Sean. She realized he was more aware of her vulnerabilities than she had ever been, and was subtly manipulating them for his own advantage. Sean was employed part-time, a fact she was initially accepting of. Meanwhile, she dutifully clocked in her full-time hours, not begrudging him his seemingly easier schedule. However, she began to recognize an unspoken expectation falling heavily on her shoulders. The household chores were her domain alone. Every single day, she found herself knee-deep in dirty laundry, battling with stubborn stains and ironing out wrinkled clothes. Her hands constantly pruned from washing the never-ending pile of dishes, remnants of their meals serving as a constant reminder of her thankless job. And cooking, that was an entirely different ballgame. Every night, like a ritual, she would be seen juggling pans and pots, stirring a delicious meal for Sean, who was ensconced in his own world. Despite all this, she remained silent, choosing to swallow her frustration rather than voice it. "Oh well, it's just one of those things," she would often mutter to herself, downplaying her growing resentment. Sean, on the other hand, was oblivious to her mounting exhaustion. He relished in the luxury of sleeping late, the sun high and bright before he would even stir from bed. His days was often spent locked away in his computer room, engrossed in his virtual world, leaving her alone to manage their real one. One evening, while she was busy stirring the pot, she called out, "Sean, could you please give me a hand with setting the table?" "Later, love," came the distant reply from the computer room as always. She sighed, dropping the subject, just as she had done countless times before. Yet the silent plea for acknowledgement lingered in the air, marking the growing distance between them. When Sean's father Robert fell seriously ill, Sean implored Janice to move in with him, expressing a dutiful desire to look after his ailing father. Robert was aging, frail, and evidently incapable of managing himself alone. But as Janice had anticipated, she ended up shouldering the responsibilities of two men instead of one. However, Janice held no resentment toward Robert. Instead, she embraced him as though he were her own father, caring for him with patience and kindness. Robert, in turn, grew exceptionally fond of Janice. He noticed, perhaps more acutely than she realized, the imbalance in the way his son treated her. One day, he shared cryptic advice with her, saying, "You, my dear, were never meant to settle." His words puzzled her, leaving a question in her mind that would resurface later. When Robert's health improved, he suggested they return to their own home, grateful for his recovery but exhausted from the additional caregiving. A few months after they were settled, tragedy struck Janice's family. Her aunt succumbed to a heart attack. Although Janice felt a twinge of sadness that she wasn't treated with the same warmth her aunt showed her own daughters, her heart still ached at the loss. After all, it was this woman who sheltered and fed her after her own mother's untimely death. Deep down, she harbored a profound love for her aunt. 3 days into her mourning, Sean lost his temper at Janice. "She's dead, Janice. Stop bringing her up, and for God's sake, stop crying," he exploded. "Sean," Janice retorted, her voice wavering, "it's only been 3 days." She hadn't even cried that much. Her grief was mostly silent, carried in her heart rather than shown on her face, yet Sean seemed to have little understanding or patience for her quiet sorrow. Now, in the bustling airport, Janice snapped back to reality from her chain of thoughts. A part of her wanted to confront Sean, to vent her anger on his mistress, but it was too late. They had vanished into the crowd, while the airport buzzed with people rushing to catch their flights. She stumbled out into the street, vision blurred with tears. As she blindly bumped into passerby, they deftly steered clear of her. In her emotional haze, she took a turn into a quiet alleyway and found a bench blanketed with snow. She sat down and let her tears flow freely. Janice lost track of time. She was roused from her sobs by the biting cold. In her emotional fog, a blizzard had crept up on her. She stood up, dusted the snow off, and rubbed her frost-coated eyes. Her eyelashes were fluffy with ice crystals, a sight that might have been beautiful if she could have seen it. As she started walking towards the exit of the alley, she noticed a man hunched over on the curb, his figure coated in snow. Her first thought was that he must be out of his mind to sit in this freezing weather. She was too wrapped up in her own turmoil to concern herself with him. As she walked past him, a glimpse of his eyes, empty and lost, tugged at her heartstrings. On impulse, she turned back and walked over to him. She rummaged in her pockets, found some cash, and extended it to him. He looked up at her with his melancholic eyes. He made no move to take the money, just went back to staring blankly into the distance. Caught off guard, Janice blurted, "Excuse me, sir, might you need some assistance?" She received no response. She found herself questioning her actions. What on earth am I doing, offering help to a stranger who won't even acknowledge me? In a desperate attempt, she suggested, "Perhaps I could get you a warm tea or something?" The faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corners of the man's lips. Encouraged, she didn't wait for an affirmation. She stepped into a nearby cafe, purchased a hot tea and a sandwich, and brought them back to the man. Regardless of her own troubles, aiding the man brought a comforting feeling of accomplishment. It was as if she could momentarily set her worries aside. She handed the man the steaming cup of tea and the sandwich. He looked up at her. This time, his eyes reflected gratitude. As she walked away, the residual warmth in her heart made her feel slightly better. She was hailing a taxi when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find the man standing there. "I'm sorry, miss. I forgot to express my gratitude. Thank you for your kindness," he said softly. She responded with a faint smile. "It's no trouble at all. We all face problems in life. I hope you find your way out of yours." "Thank you," he replied. Turning around, he slowly began to walk away. As he did, Janice noticed him shivering in the cold. A sudden urge surged within her to extend further help. "Wait," she called out after him. "How about you come to my place? You can warm up there and I can make you a hot meal." The man looked taken aback. "Are you sure? I'm just a homeless man." Janice shrugged. "Have you spotted any royalty here?" "I guess not, but it's unusual. Most people avoid me." "People are different, that's all," she concluded. Janice waved down a taxi. Upon seeing her, the driver wore a friendly smile and held the door open. However, his expression shifted to unease when Janice extended her hand to help the homeless man into the vehicle. "I can't believe it. Are you actually bringing him along?" "He's not stepping foot in my car, lady. I'm sorry." "Excuse me?" Janice replied, taken aback. "I'm sorry, but look at him. He's clearly not clean and he has a strong odor. I'm going to have to cancel your ride." "Who's going to cover the cleaning costs?" the driver retorted. Janice, angered by the driver's blatant disrespect, clenched her jaw, reached into her purse, and pulled out a wad of cash. "Would this sway your opinion?" she asked, handing him the money. The driver took the money, his fingers swiftly counting the bills. Once he recognized the generous amount, a grin spread across his face. "All right then, get in." The hefty amount Janice had handed the driver seemed to make him chatty. He nattered on about the weather and griped about the low fares he usually received. Once they reached their destination, the driver sped away swiftly. Upon entering the warm house, the homeless man let out a satisfied sigh. "It's so cozy here," the man said. "I'm going to heat up some food. You're welcome to warm up here or take a hot shower. The bathroom has towels and a rope you can use." "Thank you. I know I'm imposing, but I'll gladly accept your offer. Things have been pretty tough, particularly without a proper bath," he admitted. Janice questioned her sanity several times over. After all, she had invited an absolute stranger into her home. She didn't even know his name, and now this man was in her bathroom. Regardless of how many times she questioned her decision, she couldn't find a logical explanation. It was a spur-of-the-moment choice. Her life would never be the same from this day forward. She was just putting the finishing touches on the table when the man emerged from the bathroom, fresh and clean. Janice gawked in surprise and finally remarked, "You look like a different person," he chuckled in response. Janice had managed to set the table in the meantime. As Dylan, the guest who had unexpectedly filled the chair usually occupied by Sean, tasted the warm meal, he complimented its flavors. His words weren't just a passing comment, but genuine praise about the deliciousness of the food. As she listened to him, Janice had an epiphany. It had been an eternity since she had received any form of appreciation. Dylan, a man who was still essentially a stranger to her, displayed a keen sense of observation. He pointed out specific elements of the meal, appreciating the subtle blending of spices and the perfect balance of flavors. This simple act of recognition, so genuine and spontaneous, stirred something within Janice. It sent a ripple of excitement through her heart. It was then that she realized how accustomed she had become to her labor of love being overlooked. For so long she had toiled tirelessly without a word of thanks or a morsel of gratitude. But with just a few sincere words, Dylan had managed to validate her efforts, and for that, she felt a warm glow of appreciation. Feeling a sense of comfort in Dylan's company, Janice found the courage to ask, "So, what's your story?" As the words left her lips, she saw a sudden shift in Dylan's demeanor. His easy smile faltered, and his eyes welled up with unshed tears. It was clear that revisiting his past was a road paved with sorrow for him. Just 2 short years ago, Dylan's life was the picture of normality, the kind most people yearned for. A loving wife, a sweet little daughter, and a cozy house in the suburbs painted a picture of perfect domesticity. They had plans for a joyous family trip to celebrate their daughter's 6th birthday. They had all been looking forward to the little getaway, but life had other plans. As they drove on the rain-soaked mountain pass, their car lost control, skidded dangerously, and plunged over the guardrail. In that terrifying moment, Dylan's world was shattered. His wife and daughter, the core of his existence, were cruelly snatched away in the tragic accident. It was a harsh twist of fate that Dylan himself survived the crash, physically unharmed but emotionally devastated. As he shared his story, the pain in his voice echoed in the silence of the room. Janice could feel the heart-wrenching sorrow etched into every word. The anguish of losing his loved ones was more than Dylan could bear. He was engulfed by a sea of guilt, pinning the blame for their untimely deaths squarely on himself. Residing in a house once pulsing with life, the merry laughter of his little girl, the loving whispers of his wife, was now a torturous ordeal. The walls echoed with their memories, every corner a cruel reminder of his loss. To numb the piercing pain and escape his tormenting thoughts, he sought solace in the bitter embrace of alcohol, but the temporary escape soon spiraled into a damaging habit. As he retreated into a shell of self-condemnation, he pushed away everyone who attempted to extend a helping hand. Friends, family, their efforts to pull him out of his despair met with a brick wall of refusal. For Dylan, life had lost its luster, its very essence fading into the gloom of his grief. His mounting addiction and the hollow echo of his family's laughter in his lonely house began to take a toll on his professional life. He received multiple warnings from his employers, each one falling on deaf ears. Inevitably, he was fired. A few months later, with his finances drained and debts mounting, he was evicted from the home that had once been the center of his universe. His life, once marked by love and laughter, had succumbed to an unending spiral of despair. Finding sustenance became a daily battle for Dylan. Initially, he resorted to foraging from trash dumpsters, an experience that left him grappling with feelings of degradation and despair. However, as he gradually learned the ropes of street survival, he discovered that there were some restaurants willing to lend a helping hand to the homeless. Establishments specializing in bread products, such as bagels and sandwiches, often had surplus food that they were willing to give away. His guilt over the tragic loss of his family had initially led him to this destitute lifestyle. However, over time, he began to see the damaging effects of homelessness. The harsh realities of street life began to weigh heavily on him, pulling him down into a cycle of despair that seemed increasingly difficult to escape. The lifestyle he had initially chosen as a form of self-punishment was now trapping him, threatening to consume him entirely. Janice listened to his tale with a heavy heart, her empathy palpable. She reassured him that he shouldn't bear the blame for the accident. She implored him to understand that a life consumed by guilt wasn't worth living. Her words were earnest, full of compassion and wisdom, as she painted a picture of promising future that awaited him if he could only stop blaming himself and start putting his life back together. Throughout their conversation, Janice maintained steady eye contact, her eyes radiating warmth and understanding. Her kind smile never faltered, offering him comfort and acceptance. For Dylan, who hadn't felt such warmth and kindness in 2 long years, her generosity was overwhelming. This encounter with a complete stranger who had not only let him in for a hot shower and a meal, but had also offered him empathy and advice, was a ray of hope in his otherwise bleak existence. The spark of hope that Dylan felt was unlike anything he'd experienced in the past 2 years. He had spent so long aimlessly wandering, living on the streets, nursing his guilt and steeped in his sorrow. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to have a purpose, a goal, a desire for a future that held more than just mere survival. Meeting Janice, receiving her compassion and understanding, and hearing her encouraging words had triggered something within him. He felt a strong pull, a stirring in his heart to break free from his self-imposed chains. He began to envision a future where he could stand tall, a future where the pains of the past did not dictate his path. The desire to change was no longer a mere thought, but a compelling force driving him. He longed for the warmth of a home, the comfort of a steady job, and the healing power of connections with others. Most of all, he yearned for self-redemption, a chance to forgive himself, and the opportunity to rebuild his life from the ruins. At one point, Dylan realized he was still dressed in a borrowed robe. He jumped up, looking at himself awkwardly. "Is this your—" he started, but Janice offered a sad smile. "It's okay. Don't worry about it." Dylan sat back down. Once they had finished their meal, he rose and began gathering his dirty clothes. Sensing his discomfort, Janice told him he could use her washing machine and stay the night. "I'm sorry for being such a burden. I don't even know how to thank you." "It's all right, Dylan. Don't worry. Everything's okay." "Thank you once again." Dylan hesitated before asking his next question. "Janice, may I use your computer, please?" Dylan requested, breaking the silence. "Of course, feel free," she responded, gesturing towards her laptop. As Dylan began clicking away on her laptop, Janice sat in the living room, her mind swirling with her own tales of sorrow. She longed to unburden her heart to this stranger who had shared his deepest pain with her, but the words remained stuck in her throat. Gathering her courage, she rose and walked over to Dylan. "Dylan," she started, her voice shaking slightly, "I don't want you to think less of me for letting a stranger into my home. It's just, my husband, well, I hardly know how to put it. Today he left for a vacation with his mistress." Dylan's fingers froze above the keyboard, and he turned to look at her, his eyes widening in surprise. "Really? That happened?" She nodded, sharing a brief overview of her predicament. Dylan shook his head in disbelief. "I thought this kind of thing only happened in movies. I'm really sorry to hear that." "So what's your next move?" She sighed heavily before responding. "I'm gonna file for divorce, but..." "But what?" Dylan urged her to continue. "I'm just not sure. He might not be on board with the idea." Dylan paused, his brows furrowing before he let out a soft chuckle. "Wait, so let me get this straight. Your husband is off gallivanting with his mistress, and you're worried he might not like the idea of a divorce?" The absurdity of the situation was evident, but it wasn't amusing. As Dylan looked into Janice's eyes, he saw a hint of fear mingling with the confusion. This kind, innocent woman, so beautiful in her simplicity, was caught in a whirlpool of emotional turmoil. "Are you scared of him?" he gently asked. "I don't know. We've been together for 5 years, and now I just don't know what to do." Dylan nodded sympathetically. "Go ahead and get some rest, Janice. We'll figure something out together." Dylan shook his head again and turned back to the computer screen. Exhausted, Janice decided to stretch out on the couch. She was awoken by the sound of her alarm clock the next morning. As she walked into the living room, she realized Dylan was gone. He had left a note on the side table. "Thank you. Till we meet again." Suddenly, the house felt too quiet. Janice was hit by a wave of unexpected loneliness. It was as if she had lost something precious. She shuffled into the kitchen to make herself a coffee. The subsequent 2 weeks passed in a blur. Janice threw herself into her work, staying late into the night just so she could return home exhausted and fall straight to sleep. 3 days after Sean departed, Janice mustered all her courage and started the divorce process. Methodically, she packed up all his belongings, including the robe Dylan had worn after his shower. Now, all she needed to do was deliver the divorce papers, return his possessions, and erase him from her life. She changed the house locks too, just for good measure. This house was her sanctuary, a place that she had inherited from her parents. It was the one thing that was unquestionably hers, and yet she felt a creeping unease that she might have to battle to keep it. Oddly enough, she found her thoughts straying to Dylan more than to Sean. Dylan, who had appeared in her life as a homeless stranger, only to reveal himself as a completely different person. Janice had expected to be devastated by her husband's betrayal, but her heart remained quiet. Instead, she felt a sense of relief. At least she was no longer living in ignorance, fooled by a man she thought she knew. It often happens that everyone else knows about the betrayal, and wives are the last to find out. It can make them appear foolish in the eyes of others. Janice's mood only improved with her newfound freedom. She was already envisioning herself preparing a salad and watching a romantic film, enjoying a quiet evening at home. One evening after work, her tranquil days were interrupted. As she was approaching the house, she saw Sean pacing near the house's entrance, likely cold from the chill. She recalled having blocked his number on her phone and felt a small burst of joy that he hadn't been able to disrupt her day earlier. "Janice, what the hell is going on? What did you do to the lock? And what about my phone? Why do I have to freeze out here?" Sean demanded. Janice faced him calmly, a slight smile gracing her lips as she spoke. "I've changed the lock, Sean, and I've blocked your number." His surprise was evident, but it was short-lived. "Have you lost your mind? Who do you think you are? Hand over the keys now, and you go for a 3-hour walk in the cold. See how you like it." Janice calmly searched through her bag, causing Sean to smirk in satisfaction. She realized with a jolt how accustomed she had become to his bullying tactics, and how often she had let it pass in the past. However, instead of keys, she produced a document. "Here, these are divorce papers." Sean took the papers without thinking. "Whose divorce?" he asked, bewildered. "Ours, Sean. I know you didn't go to the Bahamas by yourself. I saw you with her. You can pick up your belongings any day, just not today. Today, I don't want to see you." He took a few breaths, and when everything dawned on him, he surprisingly spoke quite confidently. "Well, guess what? You're a rat to follow me like that. Good wives close their eyes on such things to save the marriage, and you chose the hard path. I'm a young and handsome man. I'm interesting, and women approach me." Janice interrupted him. "Well, then you won't have to spend the night on the streets." She spoke while looking at the driveway. She had never seen such cars appear in their neighborhood. A convoy of 3 large SUVs quietly entered and stopped. At that moment, Sean grabbed her hand. "You're gonna do what I say. You thought you could leave me just like that? Well, you were wrong. I'm gonna make your life miserable. Give me the keys, now." He raised his other hand to strike Janice. She closed her eyes and in the next moment realized that no one was holding her hand anymore. "Janice, are you okay?" She opened her eyes. It couldn't be. It was Dylan's voice. He was standing in front of her, rubbing his fist. Behind him, Sean was struggling in the snow, while a few strong guys stood between Dylan and Sean. Janice smiled. "It's you?" "Yes, it's me. I was worried I wouldn't make it in time. Any chance you have more of those delicious meals?" Dylan asked, a smile lighting up his eyes. Janice nodded, her eyes suddenly brimming with tears. Evidently, all the pent-up tension and stress had finally found a release. She buried her face into Dylan's chest, staining his expensive coat with tears. He gently patted her back, softly uttering, Hey, it's okay. Everything's okay now." Sean, who was struggling to get back on his feet, was a mere spectator in this emotional reunion. His earlier arrogance was replaced with a stunned and shocked expression. Dylan's arrival not only saved Janice from the immediate threat posed by Sean, but also signaled a turning point in her life. It was the moment when she finally let go of her past and took the first step towards a new and potentially happier life. As for Sean, he watched his whole world crumble in front of his eyes. His threats fell on deaf ears, and the realization of losing Janice began to sink in. Comfortably nestled in front of the television, Janice busied herself with brewing some fresh tea as Dylan began to reveal another part of his life that he hadn't previously shared with her. The words she had imparted to him about letting go of the past and forging ahead had struck a chord deep within him. She had unknowingly guided him towards a newfound sense of purpose and resilience. Once again embarking on the path of professionalism, Dylan returned to his previous job, to the joy and relief of his friends and colleagues who had missed his presence. As an agent for the Secret Service, he held a unique and critical role. His first order of business upon his return was to ensure Janice's safety and security, establishing a protective detail to watch over her. "You pulled me back from the brink, Janice," he admitted. "I couldn't simply overlook the kindness you've shown me." Janice looked at him in disbelief. "Secret Service, huh?" she repeated, trying to comprehend the information. Dylan nodded, sipping his tea. "Yes, I've been working there for years. When I lost my family, I lost myself too. I left everything behind and spiraled into a dark place. I couldn't even bring myself to reach out to my colleagues. But you reminded me that life is worth living, that it's possible to start anew even when it feels like the world has ended." Janice was silent, stunned. A multitude of emotions flashed in her eyes: surprise, confusion,
appreciation, and something else Dylan couldn't quite identify. After a moment, she managed a small smile. "Thank you for everything." The tranquil silence that now enveloped Janice's house was a stark contrast to the turmoil that had taken place just an hour earlier. The events had unfolded so swiftly that Janice was still reeling from them. Dylan had departed without uttering any promises, without giving her any clues about his next course of action. He had simply thanked her and left. Remarkably, despite Sean's deeds, Dylan had managed to find a silver lining. In a tone brimming with sarcasm, he thanked Sean for his indiscretions. If it hadn't been for Sean's affair, Dylan would have never crossed paths with Janice. He expressed his gratitude for this unexpected, yet significant meeting, adding another layer of complexity to the day's events. 2 days passed, filled with mundane routine work and quiet evenings at home. The roller coaster of emotions from a couple of days ago had begun to subside, leaving Janice with an unusual sense of tranquility mixed with curiosity about what the future held. One evening, after a long day at work, Janice was heading back home. As she walked along the familiar route, she saw a figure that made her heart flutter. There, standing a little distance from her front gate, was Dylan. He stood tall under the gentle evening light, his silhouette casting a long shadow on the pavement. He was looking her way, a smile illuminating his face. In his hands he held a bunch of flowers, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the fading light of the day. His appearance was significantly different from their last encounter. He was well-groomed and dressed neatly, a far cry from the disheveled man she had first met. His eyes, once haunted by despair, were now twinkling with hope and what seemed like happiness. At that moment, Janice remembered her ex-husband's father's words. "You, my dear, were never meant to settle." She now understood the meaning of his words.
Der Champagner prickelte auf meiner Zunge, während ich durch den festlich geschmückten Saal von Novatec schritt. 20 Jahre harte Arbeit, manifestiert in glänzendem Marmor und funkelndem Kristall. Unser Lebenswerk. Meins und Lukas. Sophie, meine Assistentin, eilte mit besorgtem Gesichtsausdruck auf mich zu. »Frau Winter, ich muss dringend mit Ihnen sprechen.« »Nicht jetzt«, winkte ich ab und nahm einen weiteren Schluck. »Die Rede beginnt gleich. Aber es ist wichtig. Es geht um Herrn Winter und...« »Sophie, bitte. Dies ist sein Moment. Unser Moment.« Das leise Klingen eines Glases durchschnitt den Raum. Lukas stand auf dem kleinen Podium. Das warme Spotlicht ließ sein ergrauendes Haar silbern schimmern. Mein Herz machte einen kleinen Sprung, wie damals vor 20 Jahren, als wir uns kennenlernten. Er war noch immer der attraktivste Mann im Raum. »Liebe Gäste«, begann er, seine Stimme fest und klar. »Heute feiern wir nicht nur 20 erfolgreiche Jahre von Novatec. Heute ist auch der Tag für einen Neuanfang.« Etwas in seinem Ton ließ mich erstarren. Sophie griff nach meinem Arm. »Die letzten Monate haben mir gezeigt, dass es Zeit für Veränderungen ist. Privat und geschäftlich.« Seine Augen suchten den Raum ab, aber nicht nach mir. »Clara und ich werden heiraten.« Das Glas entglitt meinen Fingern. Das Klirren hallte durch die plötzliche Stille. Clara, unsere neue Marketingdirektorin. 28 Jahre alt. Zoe Marie und ich haben uns auseinandergelebt. Wir werden uns trennen. Die Worte trafen mich wie Peitschenhiebe. Meine Beine wurden weich, aber ich zwang mich, aufrecht zu bleiben. Aus dem Augenwinkel sah ich Clara, strahlend in ihrem roten Kleid, wie sie triumphierend lächelte. Max, unser Finanzchef, war plötzlich an meiner Seite. »Komm«, flüsterte er, »lass uns hier raus.« »Nein.« Meine Stimme war ein Zischen. »Ich werde nicht weglaufen.« Lukas sprach weiter über Neuausrichtung und Zukunftsvisionen. Worte, die wie durch Watte zu mir drangen. 20 Jahre. Wir hatten dieses Unternehmen zusammen aufgebaut, jeden Rückschlag gemeinsam überwunden, jeden Erfolg zusammen gefeiert. Die Gäste applaudierten höflich, unsicher angesichts der unerwarteten Wendung. Einige warfen mir mitleidige Blicke zu. Andere tuschelten bereits. Meine Schwester Anna stand neben ihrem Mann Felix und schüttelte nur den Kopf. Als Lukas von der Bühne stieg, ging Clara ihm entgegen. Er küsste sie, direkt vor allen. Vor mir. In diesem Moment kristallisierte sich etwas in mir. Die Demütigung verwandelte sich in eiskalte Wut. Sie dachten wohl, ich würde einfach verschwinden, mich zurückziehen, ihnen das Feld überlassen. Ich hob ein neues Champagnerglas vom Tablett eines vorbeieilenden Kellners und prostete in ihre Richtung. Lukas' Augen weiteten sich kurz, als er meinen Blick auffing. Er kannte diesen Ausdruck. Den hatte er das letzte Mal gesehen, als wir kurz vor der Pleite standen und ich schwor, das Unternehmen zu retten. Das hier war Krieg. Und ich würde nicht verlieren. Die Villa fühlte sich leer an, als ich am nächsten Morgen die Treppe hinunterstieg. 20 Jahre gemeinsames Leben, reduziert auf hallende Schritte und das leise Summen der Klimaanlage. Lukas war nicht nach Hause gekommen. Das Telefon klingelte. Anna. »Du solltest dich schämen«, sagte meine Schwester ohne Begrüßung. Einfach so stehen zu bleiben und ihn anzustarren wie eine Irre. »Guten Morgen auch dir.« Ich ging in die Küche und schaltete die Kaffeemaschine ein. »Sag mir, wie hätte ich denn deiner Meinung nach reagieren sollen? Mit Würde. Stattdessen hast du allen gezeigt, wie verbittert du bist. Kein Wunder, dass er... Dass er was? Meine Hand verkrampfte sich um das Telefon. Dass er sich eine Jüngere sucht? Dass er 20 Jahre Ehe vor allen Geschäftspartnern wegwirft? Er ist eben verliebt. Das passiert. Verliebt. Ich lachte bitter. In eine Frau, die er vor 6 Monaten eingestellt hat, während ich die Übernahme in Singapur verhandelt habe. Zoe, bitte, lass es gut sein. Unterschreib die Papiere. Und? Welche Papiere? Eine kurze Pause. Die Scheidungspapiere. Felix hat sie heute Morgen auf seinem Schreibtisch gefunden. Lukas will eine schnelle, einvernehmliche Trennung. Natürlich. Felix. Annas Mann war Lukas' Anwalt. Die perfekte Familie-Business-Verbindung. Einvernehmlich, wiederholte ich langsam. Hat er das gesagt, bevor oder nachdem er mit seiner kleinen Marketing-Expertin ins Bett gegangen ist? Du bist unmöglich, Anna schnaubte. Weißt du was? Clara ist charmant, intelligent und halb so alt wie er. Wie praktisch. Das Türklingeln unterbrach unser Gespräch. Max stand davor, eine Aktentasche in der Hand. Ich muss auflegen, sagte ich zu Anna. Dein wunderbarer Schwager schickt gerade seine Schoßhündchen. Max ist ein guter Mensch. Hör ihm zu. Ich legte auf und öffnete die Tür. Max sah müde aus, seine Krawatte saß schief. Kaffee? Fragte ich. Er nickte und folgte mir in die Küche. Lukas möchte, dass du dein Büro räumst. Die Kaffeetasse in meiner Hand zitterte leicht. Mein Büro? Er denkt, es wäre besser, wenn du von zu Hause arbeitest. Vorübergehend. Vorübergehend. Ich stellte die Tasse ab. Und was denkt Clara dazu? Max zuckte zusammen. Sie übernimmt die Marketingdirektion komplett, mit direkter Berichtslinie an Lukas. Natürlich tut sie das. Ich lehnte mich gegen die Küchentheke. Und du, Max? Was denkst du? Er schwieg lange, starrte in seinen Kaffee. Ich denke, dass hier einiges nicht stimmt. Die Zahlen der letzten Quartale. Es gibt Ungereimtheiten. Welche Art von Ungereimtheiten? Das kann ich dir nicht sagen. Nicht offiziell. Er stand auf. Aber wenn jemand zufällig die Berichte der Singapur-Übernahme genauer prüfen würde? Ich nickte langsam. Danke für den Hinweis. An der Tür drehte er sich noch einmal um. Sei vorsichtig, Zoe. Clara, sie ist nicht, wofür alle sie halten. Als er weg war, ging ich ins Arbeitszimmer und holte die Singapur-Akten hervor. Irgendwo zwischen den Zahlen und Verträgen lag der Schlüssel zu Lukas überstürztem Handeln, und ich würde ihn finden. Die Singapur-Akten enthüllten mehr, als ich erwartet hatte. Zwischen den Zeilen der Verträge und Bilanzen zeichnete sich ein Muster ab. Gelder, die verschoben wurden, Projekte mit überhöhten Budgets, mysteriöse Beraterhonorare. Und immer wieder tauchte ein Name auf. Phoenix Consulting. Sophie klopfte an meine Bürotür. »Frau Winter, Clara ist hier.« Ich schloss die Akten. »Lass sie rein.« Clara trug ein cremefarbenes Kostüm, das vermutlich mehr kostete als das durchschnittliche Monatsgehalt unserer Angestellten. Sie setzte sich unaufgefordert. »Ich dachte, wir sollten reden«, sagte sie mit diesem süßlichen Lächeln, das ich schon auf der Feier gesehen hatte. Von Frau zu Frau. Tatsächlich? Ich lehnte mich zurück. Worüber? Über die Zukunft. Lukas möchte einen sauberen Schnitt. Keine Skandale, keine schmutzige Wäsche. Sie zog einen Umschlag aus ihrer Designertasche. Ein großzügiges Angebot. Ich öffnete den Umschlag nicht. Wie großzügig von ihm. Hat er dir auch von Phoenix Consulting erzählt? Ein kurzes Flackern in ihren Augen. Ich weiß nicht, wovon Sie reden. Nein? Ich schob ihr eines der Dokumente zu. Interessant, denn laut diesem Vertrag warst du dort Projektleiterin. 6 Monate bevor Lukas dich bei Novatec eingestellt hat. Sie wurde blass. Das ist Vergangenheit. Genau wie unsere Ehe, nicht wahr? Ich stand auf. Aber weißt du, was der Unterschied ist? Über eine gescheiterte Ehe kann man hinwegkommen. Über Betrug und Unterschlagung in Millionenhöhe. Das ist eine andere Geschichte. Sie haben keine Beweise. Ihre Stimme zitterte leicht. Noch nicht. Aber ich werde sie finden. Das Telefon klingelte. Max' Nummer. Entschuldige mich, sagte ich zu Clara. Das könnte wichtig sein. Sie erhob sich hastig. Denken Sie an das Angebot. Es gilt nicht ewig. Kaum war sie draußen, nahm ich den Anruf an. Max klang gehetzt. Zoe, hör zu. Ich habe die Verbindung gefunden. Phoenix Consulting ist eine Scheinfirma. Gegründet von... Ein Krachen, dann Stille. Max? Mein Herz raste. Max! Keine Antwort. Ich griff nach meiner Tasche und rannte zum Aufzug. Als sich die Türen öffneten, stand Lukas darin. Wo willst du hin? Seine Stimme war eisig. Zu Max. Er antwortet nicht mehr. Max hatte einen kleinen Unfall. Lukas trat aus dem Aufzug. Nichts Ernstes. Aber vielleicht solltest du dich mehr um deine eigene Gesundheit sorgen. Die Drohung in seinen Worten war unmissverständlich. Zum ersten Mal seit 20 Jahren sah ich nicht mehr den Mann, den ich geheiratet hatte. Vor mir stand ein Fremder. Was ist aus dir geworden, Lukas? Er lächelte kalt. Ich bin derselbe wie immer. Du wolltest es nur nicht sehen. Als er ging, zitterten meine Hände. Max brauchte Hilfe. Aber wenn ich jetzt unüberlegt handelte, würde ich alles verlieren. Ich musste klug vorgehen. Ich griff nach meinem Handy und wählte eine Nummer, die ich seit Jahren nicht mehr benutzt hatte. Felix, wir müssen reden. Es geht um deinen Bruder. Felix wartete in einem abgelegenen Café am Stadtrand. Seine Hände umklammerten eine unberührte Kaffeetasse, die knöchelweiß vor Anspannung. Du hättest nicht kommen sollen, sagte er, als ich mich setzte. Max liegt im Krankenhaus. Ich lehnte mich vor. Dein Bruder hat ihn dorthin gebracht. Das weißt du nicht. Felix' Blick huschte zur Tür. Manchmal passieren einfach Unfälle. Wie bei eurem Vater? Er erstarrte. Die Tasse in seinen Händen zitterte leicht. Das war vor 30 Jahren, flüsterte er. Ein Autounfall, der nie aufgeklärt wurde. Ich zog einen USB-Stick aus meiner Tasche. Genau wie die Gründung von Phoenix Consulting. Interessant, dass beide Ereignisse im selben Monat stattfanden. Felix schloss die Augen. Hör auf damit. Warum? Weil du die Wahrheit kennst? Weil du all die Jahre geschwiegen hast? Du verstehst das nicht. Seine Stimme brach. Lukas, er hat uns gerettet. Nach Vaters Tod waren wir pleite. Die Firma stand vor dem Aus. Und das Versicherungsgeld hat alles geändert. Ein gedämpftes Schluchzen entkam ihm. Es war ein Unfall, das hat er gesagt. Ich war 17, was hätte ich tun sollen? Mein Handy vibrierte. Eine Nachricht von Sophie. Clara verlässt gerade das Büro. Sie hat Unterlagen dabei. Felix, sagte ich sanft, ich brauche deine Hilfe. Nicht nur wegen Max. Es geht um mehr. Er wird mich umbringen. Nein. Ich griff nach seiner Hand. Er wird uns alle umbringen, wenn wir nichts tun. Sieh dir an, was er mit Max gemacht hat. Felix zog seine Hand weg und stand auf. Ich kann nicht. Dann tu es für Anna. Wenn diese Sache auffliegt, und das wird sie, werden alle fallen. Auch du. Er erstarrte mitten in der Bewegung. Was willst du von mir? Zugang zu den alten Anwaltsunterlagen deines Vaters. Und deine Aussage, wenn es soweit ist. Felix' Gesicht wurde aschfahl. Das ist Selbstmord. Nein, sagte ich und stand ebenfalls auf. Das ist Gerechtigkeit. Für deinen Vater, für Max, für uns alle. Er schwankte leicht. Dann nickte er kaum merklich. Als ich das Café verließ, vibrierte mein Handy erneut. Eine unbekannte Nummer. Frau Winter? Eine weibliche Stimme. Hier ist Dr. Meyer vom städtischen Krankenhaus. Es geht um Herrn Weber. Er ist aufgewacht. Und er verlangt nach Ihnen. Mein Herz schlug schneller. Max war wach. Und er hatte Informationen, die Lukas fürchtete. Das Spiel wurde gefährlicher, aber jetzt gab es kein Zurück mehr. Max lag bleich in den weißen Krankenhauskissen, sein Gesicht von Blutergüssen gezeichnet. Als ich eintrat, versuchte er sich aufzurichten. »Nicht bewegen«, sagte ich und eilte an seine Seite. »Sie müssen wissen.« Seine Stimme war kaum mehr als ein Flüstern. »Clara, sie ist nicht.« Die Tür öffnete sich. Anna stand im Rahmen, ihre Augen geweitet. »Was machst du hier?« fragte ich scharf. »Felix hat mir von eurem Gespräch erzählt.« Sie trat näher, ihre Hände nervös ineinander verschränkt. »Ist es wahr? Das mit Vater Winter?« Max hustete schwach. »Die Unterlagen in meinem Büro, hinter dem Gemälde?« »Ruh dich aus«, unterbrach ich ihn sanft. Zu Anna gewandt: »Wir sprechen draußen.« Im Flur packte meine Schwester meinen Arm. »Du musst damit aufhören, Zoe. Das ist größer, als du denkst.« »Größer als ein Mord?« »Sch!« Anna blickte sich hektisch um. »Felix hat mir alles erzählt, über Phoenix Consulting, über die verschwundenen Gelder, aber da ist mehr.« Mein Handy vibrierte. Sophie. »Dringend. Clara war in ihrem Büro, sie hat etwas mitgenommen.« »Was weißt du?« drängte ich Anna. »Clara. Sie ist nicht zufällig bei Novatec gelandet. Sie ist...« Anna stockte, als ihr Telefon klingelte. Lukas Name leuchtete auf dem Display. »Nimm nicht ab«, bat ich. Sie ignorierte mich. »Ja?« »Verstehe.« »Natürlich.« Zu mir. »Er will dich sehen. Jetzt sofort.« »Sag ihm.« »Er ist im Krankenhaus. Unten in der Lobby.« Mein Herz setzte einen Schlag aus. Er wusste, dass ich hier war, dass ich mit Max gesprochen hatte. »Geh nicht«, flüsterte Anna. »Bitte. Du kennst ihn nicht wirklich. Niemand kennt ihn.« »Doch«, sagte ich und drückte ihre Hand. »Jetzt kenne ich ihn.« In der Lobby stand Lukas am Fenster. Das Abendlicht warf seinen Schatten lang über den Boden. »Die Unterlagen aus Max' Büro«, sagte er, ohne sich umzudrehen. »Wo sind sie?« »Welche Unterlagen?« Er drehte sich um. Sein Lächeln war kalt. »Clara ist seine Tochter, weißt du? Die Tochter des Mannes, den ich...« »Nun ja.« Die Erkenntnis traf mich wie ein Schlag. Clara, die Tochter von Lukas ermordetem Geschäftspartner. »All die Jahre«, fuhr Lukas fort, »habe ich sie unterstützt. Aus der Ferne, bis sie alt genug war, um ihren Teil zu spielen.« »Sie weiß es nicht«, erkannte ich. »Sie denkt, du liebst sie.« »Wie ich dich geliebt habe?« Er lachte leise. »Liebe ist ein nützliches Werkzeug, nichts weiter.« Draußen heulte eine Sirene. Polizei. »Du hast sie gerufen«, stellte Lukas fest. »Wie vorhersehbar.« »Nein«, sagte ich und sah, wie sich Überraschung in seinem Gesicht spiegelte. Das war Felix. Der Vorstandssaal von Novatec war in kaltes Morgenlicht getaucht, als ich die Beweise präsentierte. Projektionen von Kontoauszügen, E-Mails und Verträgen flimmerten über die Wand. Die Gesichter der Vorstandsmitglieder wurden mit jeder Folie bleicher. »Diese Unterlagen«, sagte ich und legte den USB-Stick auf den Tisch, »beweisen jahrelange systematische Veruntreuung durch unseren CEO.« Lukas saß am anderen Ende des Tisches, sein Gesicht eine Maske der Gelassenheit. Nur seine Finger, die rhythmisch auf die Armlehne tippten, verrieten seine Anspannung. Die Tür öffnete sich. Clara trat ein, in ihrer Hand eine rote Mappe. »Entschuldigen Sie die Verspätung«, sagte sie lächelnd, »aber ich habe hier etwas, das Sie alle interessieren wird.« Mein Blick traf Annas, die am Ende des Raums stand. Sie schüttelte kaum merklich den Kopf. Clara öffnete die Mappe. »Während Frau Winter uns ihre kreativen Theorien präsentiert, möchte ich Ihnen die wahren Zahlen zeigen.« »Die wahren Zahlen?« fragte ich scharf. »Aus Max Webers Büro.« Sie lächelte süß. »Interessant, wie viele Überweisungen von Novatec-Konten auf private Offshore-Konten führen. Konten, die auf den Namen Zoe Marie Winter laufen.« Der Raum explodierte in aufgeregtem Gemurmel. Ich starrte auf die Dokumente, die Clara verteilte. Sie sahen echt aus. Zu echt. »Das ist absurd«, sagte ich, aber meine Stimme zitterte. »Max würde nie...« »Max Weber liegt im Krankenhaus«, unterbrach Lukas sanft, nachdem er einen Nervenzusammenbruch erlitt. Ausgelöst durch Schuldgefühle, wie sein Therapeut bestätigt. »Sein Therapeut?« »Dr. Meyer.« Lukas' Lächeln wurde breiter. »Sie haben doch mit ihm gesprochen, oder nicht? Im Krankenhaus?« Die Erkenntnis traf mich wie ein Schlag. Der Anruf. Die mysteriöse Ärztin. Es war eine Falle gewesen. »Sie verstehen nicht«, versuchte ich es noch einmal. »Phoenix Consulting war ein brillanter Schachzug von Ihnen«, vollendete Clara. »Eine Scheinfirma gegründet, um Gelder zu waschen. Wir haben alle Beweise.« Der Vorstandsvorsitzende erhob sich schwer. »Frau Winter, in Anbetracht dieser Anschuldigungen müssen wir Sie bitten, das Gebäude zu verlassen. Die Polizei wurde bereits informiert.« Ich sah zu Anna, aber sie war verschwunden. Felix' Platz war leer. »Eine letzte Sache«, sagte Lukas und stand auf. »Die Unterlagen aus Max' Büro. Wo sind sie?« Ich lachte bitter. »In Sicherheit, bei jemandem, der die Wahrheit kennt.« »Sie meinen Felix?« Clara zog ein Smartphone hervor. »Er ist gerade auf dem Weg nach Singapur.« »Geschäftlich, verstehen Sie?« Sirenen heulten in der Ferne. Lukas trat näher, seine Stimme nur ein Flüstern. »Schachmatt, Liebling. Diesmal habe ich wirklich alles bedacht.« Die Türen öffneten sich. Polizisten strömten herein. Ich hatte alles verloren. Nicht nur meine Ehe, mein Unternehmen, sondern auch meine Freiheit. Und das Schlimmste? Lukas würde damit durchkommen. Wieder einmal. Die Polizeistation war still um Mitternacht. Ich saß im Verhörraum, die Handschellen kalt an meinen Handgelenken, als die Tür sich öffnete. Clara trat ein. »Wo ist Lukas?« fragte ich. »Beschäftigt.« Sie setzte sich mir gegenüber. »Er weiß nicht, dass ich hier bin.« Ich studierte ihr Gesicht. Die perfekte Maske begann zu bröckeln. »Hat er dir je von deinem Vater erzählt?« Sie erstarrte. »Was?« »Phoenix Consulting wurde vor 30 Jahren gegründet. Von deinem Vater und Lukas.« Ich lehnte mich vor. »Einen Monat später starb dein Vater bei einem Unfall.« »Sie lügen.« Aber ihre Stimme zitterte. »Die Unterlagen, die Felix hat? Sie beweisen alles. Auch wie Lukas dich all die Jahre beobachtet hat. Wie er dich manipuliert hat, hierher zu kommen.« Die Tür öffnete sich erneut. Anna stand dort, bleich, aber entschlossen. »Sie hat recht, Clara. Ich habe die Beweise gesehen.« Clara sprang auf. »Das ist absurd. Lukas liebt mich, »Wie er mich geliebt hat?« unterbrach ich sanft. »Wie er deinen Vater geliebt hat?« »Lukas liebt nur die Macht.« Annas Handy piepte. Sie las die Nachricht und nickte mir zu. »Es ist soweit.« Clara sah zwischen uns hin und her. »Was ist soweit?« »Felix ist nicht in Singapur«, erklärte Anna. »Er ist bei der Staatsanwaltschaft. Mit allen Unterlagen.« Claras Gesicht verlor jede Farbe. »Nein, nein, das kann nicht.« Die Tür flog auf. Lukas stürmte herein, seine sonst so perfekte Fassade zerbröckelt. »Du!« fauchte er mich an. »Was hast du getan?« »Ich? Gar nichts.« Ich stand langsam auf. »Du hast das alles selbst getan. Vor 30 Jahren, als du deinen besten Freund ermordet hast. Und jetzt, wo du seine Tochter benutzt hast.« Clara würgte. »Papa! Er wurde ermordet?« »Es war ein Unfall«, schrie Lukas. »Er wollte aussteigen, uns verraten. Ich musste...« Er verstummte abrupt, als ihm klar wurde, was er gerade gestanden hatte. Hinter ihm erschienen 2 Polizisten. Diesmal echte. »Danke, dass Sie das aufgezeichnet haben«, sagte einer von ihnen und nickte zu der kleinen Kamera an Annas Revers. Lukas' Augen weiteten sich in plötzlicher Erkenntnis. Er wirbelte zu Clara herum, die zurückwich. »Du warst nur Mittel zum Zweck«, sagte ich leise. »Wie wir alle.« Als sie ihn abführten, blieb er kurz in der Tür stehen. »Du denkst, du hast gewonnen?« »Nein«, antwortete ich. »Niemand gewinnt hier. Aber zumindest gibt es endlich Gerechtigkeit.« Clara schluchzte leise. Anna legte einen Arm um sie. Die Handschellen wurden mir abgenommen. Draußen dämmerte bereits der Morgen. Ein neuer Tag. Aber der Geschmack der Rache war bitter in meinem Mund. Manchmal gibt es keine Gewinner in einem Krieg. Nur Überlebende. Der Gerichtssaal war überfüllt, als das Urteil verkündet wurde. Lebenslang für Lukas. Nicht nur für den Mord an Claras Vater, sondern auch für jahrelange Veruntreuung und versuchten Mord an Max. Ich sah zu Clara hinüber, die zwischen Anna und Felix saß. Sie wirkte älter jetzt. die Unschuld aus ihrem Gesicht gewichen. Unsere Blicke trafen sich kurz und ich erkannte in ihren Augen denselben Schmerz, den ich all die Jahre getragen hatte. Als die Richter den Saal verließen, kam Max zu mir. Er stützte sich noch auf einen Stock, aber sein Gang wurde sicherer. »Novatec braucht einen neuen CEO«, sagte er leise. »Ich weiß.« Ich beobachtete, wie Lukas abgeführt wurde. Er drehte sich nicht um. »Der Vorstand will dich.« »Nein.« Ich stand auf. »Ich überlasse das dir, Max. Ich bin fertig hier.« Er griff nach meinem Arm. »Was wirst du tun?« Die Frage hallte in mir nach. Was tat man, wenn die Rache vollbracht war? Wenn die Gerechtigkeit gesiegt hatte, aber der Sieg sich hohl anfühlte? Draußen vor dem Gerichtsgebäude wartete Sophie mit einem Umschlag. »Die Papiere für den Verkauf ihrer Anteile«, sagte sie. »Alles wie besprochen.« Ich unterschrieb, ohne zu zögern. Ein Teil von mir starb mit jeder Unterschrift, aber ein anderer Teil wurde freier. Clara trat aus dem Gebäude. Sie zögerte, kam dann aber auf mich zu. »Ich habe die Wahrheit über meinen Vater nie gekannt«, sagte sie. »Bis jetzt. Manchmal ist die Wahrheit das Schwerste.« »Was er mir angetan hat«, ihre Stimme brach. »Was er uns allen angetan hat.« Ich legte meine Hand auf ihre. »Die Entscheidung liegt bei dir. Du kannst in seinem Schatten leben oder deinen eigenen Weg finden.« Sie nickte langsam und ging. Anna wartete bei meinem Auto. »Du gehst wirklich?« »Es gibt nichts mehr für mich hier. Außer Familie.« Sie umarmte mich fest. Das hätte ich früher erkennen sollen. Der Wind frischte auf, trug den Geruch von Regen heran. Ich stieg ins Auto und startete den Motor. Im Rückspiegel sah ich das Gerichtsgebäude kleiner werden, sah, wie Max und Sophie sich unterhielten, wie Felix Anna in den Arm nahm, wie Clara alleine dastand und zum Himmel schaute. Wir alle trugen unsere Narben, unsere Geschichten, unsere Versionen der Wahrheit. Ich hatte meine Rache bekommen, hatte Gerechtigkeit gefunden. Aber der Preis war hoch gewesen. Zu hoch vielleicht. Der erste Regentropfen traf die Windschutzscheibe, als ich die Stadtgrenze erreichte. Ich hielt nicht an. Manchmal war der einzige Weg vorwärts, alles hinter sich zu lassen. Auch die Rache.